Alright, welcome back to Applied Behavior Analysis in Early Childhood. We are now in the verbal behavior unit, and this says part 1. And I don't know if there will be a part 2, but this is where we're going to start for this week. So here are our objectives. Our objectives are 1. State the seminal book on the analysis of verbal behavior, the date it was published, its author, and a corresponding scientific journal. Identify a primary major impact of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior on applied behavior analysis. List some defining features of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. Discriminate between structural and functional characteristics of language. And list 3 primary sources of control over verbal behavior. Alright, so after 20 years of work on a conceptual analysis of behavior, in 1957, B.F. Skinner published Verbal Behavior. So that's this text over here. And Skinner's text provided the foundation for today's most scientifically supported behavioral interventions for language delays and deficits. And Skinner's verbal behavior has been very useful for helping children with autism in particular. And I provided just a sample of some of the books that have come out that describe how to teach children with autism and other developmental disabilities how to request preferred items and activities and attention from others, how to ask for information, and how to describe the environment and how they feel, how to initiate and maintain conversations with others. And one of which, or 2 of them, are the ABLES and the VB-MAP. Those are assessments and curricula. And these 2 older books, the Verbal Behavior Approach and Teaching Language to Children with Autism or Other Developmental Disabilities, are great too. So these are some standard books that ABA practitioners use to teach verbal behavior in children with autism, other developmental disabilities, and there are many more books out there as well. The major scientific journal is the analysis of verbal behavior. So a lot of the major work in the analysis of verbal behavior is published in that journal. Okay, ASR number 1. Which is true? A. John Watson is the father of radical behaviorism. B. Pavlov studied verbal behavior in 1957. C. Skinner published a seminal textbook on verbal behavior in 1957. Or D. Skinner published a seminal textbook on verbal behavior in 1938. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll. This is ASR 2. This is ASR number 1 still. So the answer here is C. Skinner published the seminal textbook on verbal behavior in 1957. Okay, so now objectives 3 through 5. Well, let me start out by saying that Skinner criticized linguistics in psychology for their focus only on the structure of language, and for ignoring the environmental causes or determinants of language, which we would refer to as its function. Some structural features of language are words, sentences, grammar. Words, sentences, and grammar are considered the units of analysis in a traditional classification of language that would be applied by linguists, psychologists, cognitive psychologists. Now, those units are clearly important in teaching children to read and write and think. Right? So concepts associated with linguistic and psychological perspectives on language include processing, understanding, meaning, the mind, semantics, lexicon, syntax, receptive language, expressive language. But these are not concepts associated with VB or verbal behavior. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior focused instead on the function of language. That is, environmental determinants such as reinforcement, punishment, and stimulus control. The structure of language is what people say, and it's what behavior analysts refer to as form or topography. Skinner was instead interested in why people say or think what they do, and how thinking or talking work. That is, he was interested in how operant contingencies control individuals' use of what is commonly referred to as language. And Skinner's 1957 landmark text is what some people believe is what Skinner considered his most important contribution to science, actually. And verbal behavior rejects the use of mentalistic explanations for language that's commonly used by linguists and psychologists, social, for example, memory, and concepts that imply non-environmental determinants of language, such as what Skinner called an innate language organ. So, according to Skinner, the difference between linguistic and behavioral accounts of language is exemplified by the different types of questions they ask. So, linguists would ask, how is it possible for a person to understand a potentially infinite number of sentences? In contrast, a behavior analyst asks, how is it possible for a person to say a potentially infinite number of sentences? And that's because verbal behavior focused on the speaker, not the listener. Another term for speaker is verbalizer. So you can use speaker and verbalizer interchangeably. And that's fine. Skinner interpreted language as verbal behavior by referring to the same principles of behavior which describe how nonverbal behavior works. And the book does not cite any studies of verbal behavior. That is, the book doesn't have any references to experiments on verbal behavior because his analysis was an interpretation. It was just an interpretation of language and cognition based on basic principles. Although there are now hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on verbal behavior, and Skinner's analysis gave rise to many of the procedures behavior analysts use to teach children and adults how to speak, write, read, think, and problem solve. I mentioned earlier that for linguistics and psychology, the common units of analysis are either structural, but they can also be hypothetical constructs. But the unit of analysis in verbal behavior is the verbal operant. And so here are some assumptions underlying verbal behavior. Verbal behavior assumes that language is learned behavior. That is, it assumes that language is not something innate that is just drawn out from us or that just comes forth automatically through, as we mature or develop or something like that. So language isn't something that just automatically happens. It's something we learn. And it also assumes that there are no differences in the principles underlying verbal behavior and other types of behavior. It also assumes that verbal behavior specifically is operant behavior. this is quoted from Vargas, 2013, page 243. The primary sources of control over what people say, write, or gesture are these three things. The first one is deprivation or aversive stimulation. The second is features of the current environment, including the environment inside one's own body, so including private events, such as private stimuli, and other verbal behavior, so other people's verbal behavior. Okay, so primary sources. These are just overarching. We're going to get into more specific sources of specific verbal control over specific verbal operands later in this unit, but for now, we're just focusing on how there are three general or overarching sources of control. A deprivation or aversive stimulation, so we're talking motivating operations there. Features of the current environment, right? So discriminative stimuli, reinforcers, punishers, and then other verbal behavior, so the verbal behavior of other people. So Skinner believed that verbal behavior was determined by natural selection, operant selection, and cultural selection. And remember that that the ability to learn from consequences is something that Skinner thought was due to natural selection itself. And so we can look, and because cultural selection involves the selection of, well, we're going to talk a little bit more here, this selection of certain cultural practices mediated through verbal behavior, that is, that immediate consequences are also involved in selecting cultural practices and verbal behavior during cultural selection, that both operant selection and cultural selection are due to natural selection themselves. Now, in terms of cultural selection, Skinner thought that the verbal behavior of any one individual was the product of contingencies provided by listeners who have been taught to reinforce others' behavior in some characteristic way, and by the behavior of other verbal individuals. So listeners and verbal individuals, represented by these members here of the culture, comprise a verbal community which speaks a given language, engages in certain cultural practices, which are passed on across generations through cultural selection. In fact, for Skinner, verbal behavior was not a different way of looking at language. Rather, he redefined language as a verbal culture in which people speak or write in ways that shape the speaking or writing of members of the culture. So I have here is cultural selection by language is a verbal environment, is a verbal culture. So we're saying that those are the same things. And through cultural selection, verbal behavior was, quote, shaped and maintained by a verbal environment transmitted from one generation to another. That is when it became a part of a language, end quote. So here in this diagram, we have members of an audience within a verbal culture or a verbal environment who mediate reinforcement of the behavior of other members of the culture. And they do this because doing so was directly taught and passed on by prior generations of the culture. Now, there are each member of the verbal environment or the verbal culture engages in multiple variations of verbal behavior. And those variations have immediate consequences mediated through listeners or the verbal behavior of other members of the culture. And those immediate consequences select some variations increase in probability in the future, some variations decrease in probability in the future. So there's this, what we're talking about is the selection of certain cultural practices. And so some certain cultural practices or verbal variations are going to be retained and passed on and maintained in the culture, and others are going to go away. And so this selection process shapes up the verbal repertoire of a given individual speaker. All right, so the way to look at this is that the verbal repertoire of an individual speaker is shaped through operant selection and cultural selection. So to summarize, you have operant selection, cultural selection, and natural selection, all of which contribute to or determine verbal behavior. And verbal behavior is shaped up, maintained, passed on, also in part through cultural selection. And cultural selection by language or a verbal environment, a verbal culture, which consists of members of a verbal environment. Members can be other individuals engaging in verbal behavior, or they can be what is referred to as the audience, so they consist of listeners. We'll talk about the difference between speakers and listeners later. And the verbal repertoire of any given individual member is shaped up through immediate consequences, that is via operant selection, mediated by other listeners or verbalizers. Okay, let's look at ASR, the next ASR here. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior focused on A, form or understanding of language, or B, function of language or how it works. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer here is B, function of language or how it works. Next ASR. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior focused on A, the behavior of the speaker, or B, the behavior of the listener. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. Answer is the behavior of the speaker. Next ASR. Which of the following are assumptions of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior? A, language is acquired, does not automatically emerge from the mind. B, principles underlying verbal and nonverbal behavior are the same. C, verbal behavior is operant behavior, or D, all of the above. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer is all of the above. Next ASR, Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior was A, an experimental analysis of verbal behavior, or B, a reinterpretation of language. A couple more seconds. And the answer here is B. It was a reinterpretation of language. Alright, our next objectives are Objective 6, list advantages and disadvantages regarding language and cognition as verbal behavior as it relates to teaching and why it's important to teach verbal behavior. 7, define verbal behavior. 8, define and list 2 types of listener behavior and then state the relation between listener behavior and receptive language. 9, define and identify examples of mediated reinforcement. And 10, discriminate between examples and non-examples of mediated reinforcement. In this first video part, we're going to wrap things up with Objective 6, and then we're going to begin video part 2 at Objective 7. Okay, Objective 6 is to list advantages and disadvantages regarding language and cognition as verbal behavior as it relates to teaching and why it's important to teach verbal behavior. So a major advantage of conceptualizing language and cognition as verbal behavior is that we can develop behavioral technology tied to principles of behavior that can be used to teach individuals with or without language delays or deficits to talk, write, read, think, and problem solve. And that's especially important for individuals who either don't respond to typical instructional practices or otherwise would not acquire these skills. Disadvantages are that treating language and cognition as verbal behavior acknowledges the enormous complexity of language and the difficulty of the task of teaching it. And B, the sciences, and now not everyone would agree with this per se, this is a debatable thing probably, the science is in its infancy. So we don't have enough behavioral technology to teach most complex language. But there are folks out there who probably will debate that. Now, why is it important to teach verbal behavior? And this is particularly relevant to teaching individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. What we're talking about here is why it's important to treat language and cognition as operant behavior and use that assumption to apply principles of behavior to directly teach talking and thinking, language, cognition, reading, writing, problem solving. Okay, why is it important? Well, many children will not acquire some aspects of verbal behavior if they're not taught. Without a sufficient verbal repertoire, children and adults engage in challenging behavior that negatively impacts their development, their social skills, their health, education, and in some cases, their basic survival. For example, there are some individuals whose verbal repertoire is so limited or so deficient that they for most of their lives they're unable to safely and appropriately request access to preferred items and activities and food and drink and attention from others, and so they learn to engage in severe challenging behavior such as self-injurious behavior involving hitting themselves in the face or the nose, or self-biting or hitting themselves in the head in ways that actually can result in death. So for some individuals, the development of applied behavioral technology to teach verbal behavior can save lives. A verbal repertoire is necessary for the human species to transmit knowledge across space and time. To be a productive member of society, one needs to have sufficient verbal skills for basic math, reading, comprehension, writing, describing the environment, requesting, conversing, and more. Acknowledgement of the relation between speaker and listener clearly indicates that it is critical that children are taught to be great listeners as well as great speakers. And that will become more clear as we move forward and we discuss differences between speakers and listeners. But for now, it's enough to see number 5 and also know that the listener's role in this is to provide reinforcement for the speaker's behavior. Okay, so that's enough to know for now. And that wraps up video part 1. See you again in video part 2, which will begin with objective 7.